Canada's economic numbers are fairly rosy, but Canadians aren't feeling the bloom, according to pollsters. How will that impact our federal election? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. Here at the Cafe, we aim to bring you guests and issues for discussion and debate. The Unpublished Cafe is part of the Unpublished Media suite of websites created to inform and educate Canadians on current affairs and political issues. Each podcast delves into a different issue in a nonpartisan way so listeners and viewers can share their informed opinions with Canadians and their local MPs through unpublishedottawa.com and unpublished.vote. The upcoming federal election will be a focus for us as we bring you a balanced view of the parties and their policies. Well, despite declining unemployment and GDP growth in Canada, two-thirds of Canadians feel the economic deck is stacked against them, according to Ipsos Public Affairs. Traditionally, in our election cycle, one of the key issues on the trail is the economy. While there's an air of uncertainty among a majority of Canadians when it comes to the economy, will this be the hill on which the election is fought? Climate change has jumped into the fray, along with health care. Will pocketbook issues move to the forefront? Here on the Unpublished Cafe, we're going to take a look at the economic platforms of each party and see if their pledges pass the smell test. As well, we'll hear from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business to gauge their response to the promises and hear what its members are looking for from the parties. First, I'm pleased to be joined by Ian Lee, MBA Director at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. And Ian, thank you for joining us on the Unpublished Cafe.
My pleasure, Ed.
Do you see jobs and the economy as the top issue of this upcoming election?
Not top issue, but I certainly understand the question, and I'm not denying. I think it's going to be the subtext. I mean, people are going into the election to the voting booth on election day, not feeling stressed out by the economy. So the fact that it's not the number one issue is not a bad news thing for the government, for any incumbent government. It's a good news piece of information for any incumbent government, because it means that people aren't going in there, to use that famous phrase, madder than hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. Yes, there's people unhappy. I've seen the polls, and they feel they're falling behind, but it's more of a grumbling than white heat anger. And that you see in a recession when lots of people are losing their jobs and there's really angry, bitter, twisted people. We don't have that right now. Yes, there's some grumbling. Yes, there's some unhappiness, but the government of the day, the Liberal government, is very fortunate that they're not in a recession, and that those numbers are very strong. You know, the unemployment numbers and so forth, because they can use them to respond to any criticism of their record on the economy.
You know, and let's just turn that the other way. So if you're the incumbent government with decent economic numbers that you're dealing with going into the election, how do you counter that being a Conservative, an NDP, or a Green Party?
Well, you can talk, as he's doing, about, for example, the indebtedness. You can talk about the decline in exports, which is very clear. The decline in foreign direct investment in Canada because of the increasing restrictions put on, for example, the natural resource sector, and we've seen foreign direct investment in that sector just collapse. Any kind of investment, not just foreign investment, but foreign and domestic investment. So there's things they can talk about. How much they'll resonate or not, I don't know. I think it's more going to be. I know every election it's said is about the future, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're really judging the past and saying, I'm happy with the last 4 years, so let's give them another 4 years in office. I think there's a lot more uncertainty in this election, and I don't mean about only the economy by any stretch. There's uncertainty about, some people say the climate carbon tax is the way to go, and a more and more aggressive approach to carbon reduction, and there's others saying, no, this is going to blow the place up. So there's a lot of uncertainty about it's not clear cut. What is the path? I mean, to an diehard environmentalist, they'll say that's nonsense, but there's large numbers of people who don't agree. I mean, and I don't mean that they don't agree with climate change. They don't agree with the path to respond to climate change. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. There's uncertainty over, are the good times about to come to an end? Yet people can acknowledge that the economy is very good, the numbers are very strong, but there's uncertainty about whether we're on the tipping point, on the edge of a recession. So there's very great uncertainty, although it's not being talked about. I see it in the polling numbers all the time about immigration. And it's one of those things, we don't like to talk about because people think that if you raise any kind of debate or discussion about immigration, you're opposed. I'm someone who's very strongly in support of immigration. But then the question is, do we want more refugee immigration, or do we want more family immigration, or do we want more economic migrants with job skills that the economy needs? There's uncertainty over that because some people believe in one category and others believe in another category. So I don't recall an election in recent times where there's been so much uncertainty over, and I mean genuine uncertainty. I'm not talking about differences of opinion. I think there's lots of liberals I know that they're strongly supporting the carbon tax proposals, and yet underneath, if you talk to them privately, they've got misgivings of, boy, I really hope we're going down the right road, sort of thing. So that's what I mean by uncertainty. It's not black and white. It's not, you can say, oh, this is just a no-brainer. This is the way we got to go. There are serious differences of opinion on quite a few of these very, very major issues.
Ian Lee is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe, MBA director at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. We look at some of the financial platforms, economic platforms of the federal parties. And let's look at the Green Party. It's approaching climate change economically.
Right.
And it pledges to shut down the fossil fuel industry, but is promising to transition those workers fairly, reintegrating them into the renewables sector. Now, I think when it comes to whether you're dealing with climate change or not, that's always the key point. We shut down the oil sands, but you leave that huge vacuum for all those workers. Does that address the issue in dealing with the oil sands?
I don't believe it does.
No?
I don't. And I've certainly studied this. Believe me, I use this in my class all the time. And I'm a numbers-based person, so that means I'm poring over the numbers from StatsCan. These aren't theories. These are not opinions. They're not conjectures. There's about 1 million people employed directly and indirectly in natural resources. Now, natural resources is not only oil and gas. It's all upstream stuff, mining and forestry and gold and mining gold, copper, molybdenum, and so forth. But my point is, there's about 1 million people. Okay, there's 38 million Canadians. There's 18.5 million employed, according to StatsCan, right now in 2019. So 1 million people is still nonetheless, although it's by no means the majority, it's still a big chunk of people. That's the totality of the population of the fourth or fifth largest city in Canada called Ottawa, where we live. Okay? I don't mean everyone's working in Ottawa. That's the total population of Ottawa, including children and seniors. So that's a lot of people. And they're talking about literally throwing them out of work. Because if you shut down the fossil fuel industry, you are throwing them out of work. Now, and I think it's a glib response, is, oh, no problem, we'll just recycle them over here, as if it's just an exercise of punching a bunch of buttons on your computer. And economies are vastly more complex and vastly more sophisticated than that. And if it was that easy, we would have been doing it for the last 100 years. Just punch this button, punch that button, and move these several 100,000 people from here over there. And it's not that easy. And we're not a centrally planned economy. And, of course, the centrally planned economies they were far worse. They actually went bankrupt and closed down because they couldn't make these transitions and move people from one sector to another. The thing about the Green Party is not the objectives. I mean, I'm not saying they're bad because they're promoting the environment so strongly. It's the aggressiveness of their policies. They're going to do all this in 10 years. And but when you look at the numbers, I mean, use housing stock, which is 25% of all the emissions, okay? 14 million homes in Canada, that's StatsCan data, and about another 5 million buildings, schools, hospitals, university buildings, high-rise buildings, government buildings, corporation buildings, plants, etc. To retrofit that many buildings in 10 years, I believe, is impossible, physically impossible, because we don't have enough people and we don't have enough resources. It can be done. I'm not saying it cannot be done, Ed. Let's be clear. So someone says I'm denying that we can do anything. Chris Reagan, who is a very strong environmentalist, the chair of Ecofiscal Commission, was on CBC Power and Politics only last week. And he said this is going to be a transition that takes place over the next 50 or 60 or 70 years. So even he, and he's a very pro-carbon tax guy, and a very we've got to change everything person. And he's saying, no, it's not going to happen in 10 years. And so I think that's the problem with the Green Party proposals, is that they're uber aggressive, hyper aggressive, extremely aggressive, impossibly aggressive. And if someone says, well, they're aspirational, okay, fine, I have no problem with that. But I think that she's telling, and there's large numbers or significant numbers of people who really believe, you just sort of, it's like flicking a light switch on the wall and presto, abracadabra, like magic, you've got light. And, presto, we just flick a switch and there you go, and everybody's, heating their homes with electricity. And I've done renovations in my house for 30 years, serially. For 30 years I've owned my house. And I'm telling you, I know how complex it is and how difficult and how expensive it is, including ripping out the walls one by one, as I've done, to get down to the studs, to spray foam it, to fill it up with insulation to get my heating bills down, which I've done. But it took me, they're talking about retrofitting to go carbon neutral. It took me 5 years and probably $50,000. And I'm not talking the furnaces or the windows. I'm just talking ripping out the walls one by one in each and every room in my house. Unbelievably tedious and unbelievably expensive process. And that's just one house in Canada.
All right, let's look at the New Democrats. They say they'll create 300,000 good jobs in their first mandate, addressing climate crisis while making life better for all Canadians. Now, does this pledge sound much different than the Green Party's?
I don't. I think they're both fighting it out for the similar group of people that are very socially progressive and very environmentally progressive, and from all the evidence that we've seen so far, the Greens are taking votes from the NDP, and so I think they're fighting it out for the same space, philosophical, ideological space in Canada. Nothing wrong with that. It's called good old-fashioned competition, but I think that's why we see similarities. I didn't say identities or identical policies, but there's similarities between the Greens and the NDP. They're both of these parties' proposals are much more aggressive, much more radical and aggressive than are the liberal or conservative policies.
Now, the NDP is also talking about a $15 federal minimum wage. I wouldn't expect that to impact many, considering most civil servants are making more than that.
I agree with you, because if you look at the numbers, and I wrote an op-ed on the minimum wage. Minimum wage is overwhelmingly in retail, and retail is not regulated by federal government. In fact, the only industries that come under federal jurisdiction are federally regulated corporations, banking, telecom, and natural resource companies. And those three industries I just named tend to be very high-wage industries. They are not minimum wage industries. They're not, these are not hamburger flippers in telecom. And I don't say that to put down hamburger flipping. I work part-time as a student, in minimum wage jobs in retail and restaurants and that sort of thing. But all of those restaurant jobs and fast food jobs and minimum wage jobs, working in retail stores, whether it's Home Depot or Canadian Tire or Loblaws or Metro or Sobeys, that's all under provincial jurisdiction. So, yeah, I don't have at my fingertips the number of people actually under federal jurisdiction that are at minimum wage, but I'll bet you it's less than 1%.
Ian Lee
Literally, it's that tiny.
Ian Lee joining us on the Unpublished Cafe, MBA Director, Sprott School of Business at Carleton, as we talk about the federal election platforms, looking at jobs and the economy. And it appears the focus of the Conservative jobs and economy platform is, basically canceling the carbon tax to be replaced with incentives for companies to fall in line and reduce their emissions. From my perspective, they would have done that already, would they not?
No, because I'm not saying that they haven't done any. Of course they have. But I meant when I said no, if we're going to reduce yet more emissions, then everybody has to do a lot more. So future reductions in emissions can still be taken. And what he's proposing, it's almost an inverse of the traditional positions of these two parties, because the Conservative Party has historically advocated market-based solutions. And the Liberals have been tended more towards government-based solutions. And they're flipping on this, where the Liberals are very strongly supporting a carbon tax, which is widely considered to be a market-based response. And what the Conservatives are advocating is essentially what people like me like to call command and control in a centrally planned economy like China or Russia, and I'm not trying to draw any parallels at all to the Conservatives. I'm just saying, resources, books have been written on this, PhD theses have been written on this, believe me. Societies can allocate things used on a decentralized basis through market forces, profit-based companies, but supply and demand and all that stuff, or you can do it through command and control where the government does it. We actually have a mixed economy, Ed. I mean, look, hospitals are command and control. They're not market-based. I don't pay a price when I go to the hospital. It's not like buying groceries at Loblaws. So we have a society, so does the States, so does Europe, where we've got both a mix. We've got both command and control. The military system is command and control. You're ordered to go to Afghanistan. You don't say, well, wait a minute, give me a price incentive and I'll think about going, and we'll negotiate it. You don't do that in the military. That's command and control. The courts are command and control. So, when people sneer at his proposals, command and control is a legitimate solution. I'm not saying it's the most effective or efficient solution, but it also works. I mean, we did the Second World War with command and control. We didn't say to people, we'd like to give you a little bit more money to encourage you. I mean, we finally went to conscription. That's command and control. The government's commanding you to do something. And so what the Conservatives are saying is, rather than use market-based forces, we're going to go the command and control route. And ironically, and I guess I'm revealing my cards now, and I am a great capitalist. I am a huge capitalist. But I'm slowly coming to the conclusion, after looking at the huge blowback around the world towards carbon-based pricing, which is market-based pricing, it really hits people hard for things they need, like driving their car. And I've come to this bizarre conclusion as a red meat capitalist that command and control might be the way to go, because it distributes the benefits to the cost, to everybody. I, the government, order you to reduce your emissions. And if you don't like it, too bad. And there's no debate. There's no market price about it. There's nothing about avoiding. We are ordering you. We're ordering. Look, when we announce an increase in efficiency standards for appliances or mileage for cars, that's command and control. Mm-hmm. We're not asking you, do you think you might like to? We're ordering the car companies, you must increase the mileage. That's command and control. Or when we increase the standards for the to retrofit buildings, where we're saying the buildings must go from R10 in the walls to R30 or something like that. That's command and control. So he's arguing using only command and control, and the Liberals are arguing essentially a mix, because they're also arguing for command and control with the retrofitting of standard increases in retrofitting of buildings, mileage efficiency increases, and so forth. And that's really the fundamental difference. And by the way, I don't think there's a huge difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives, even though it looks like there is, and they're both arguing there's a huge difference. They're a lot closer to each other than they are to the Greens or the NDP.
And then looking at the Liberals in terms of jobs in the economy, it looks like obviously the carbon tax is a central part of the platform, but also mentioning reducing the deficit below $10 billion. And is it me, or are we not hearing enough about the deficit and reining it in during this campaign?
I don't think we are, because, in fact, let me make it even more explicit. I've heard some gargantuan promises in this campaign. Okay, let's set aside the NDP and the Greens. They're not going to get into power. But even with the Conservatives and the Liberals, I've heard an awful lot of very, very big ticket promises. And I'm just sitting there gobsmacked, to be honest. If we really are going to adopt full pharmacare, as the Liberals seem to indicate or suggest, I mean, that's $25 billion. Who said? The PBO said so. Kevin Page is on the record saying that's the equivalent of a 2 percentage point increase in the GST-HST. And so I'm saying all these multi-billion-dollar commitments, someone's got to pay. Either that, or we're going to run up gargantuan deficits like the bad old days, or we're talking gargantuan tax increases. So something's got to give. Either we don't go with huge expensive programs like fully universal pharmacare, or we're going to run whacking big deficits, or we're going to see some whacking big tax increases. And I'm not enthusiastic about any one of those options, to be quite frank. It doesn't seem a moderation in this campaign on the campaign promises side, with the two major parties, seems to have gone out the window. And someone's got to bring them back to reality and say, okay, people, we want you to talk about all these campaign promises in relation to the deficit. What's it going to do to the deficit? And how are you going to address these enormous campaign promises that are in the billions and billions of dollars? Promising $10 million promise here and there, I don't care about that because it's a rounding error with the government of Canada, because it spends $350 billion a year, which is 1/3 of $1 trillion. But when you start getting into multi-billion-dollar programs, then you're getting into, as the famous phrase says, that's real money. That's really serious money. And how are we going to address that in relation to the deficit?
Interesting point. So I want to thank you for joining us, Ian.
My pleasure, Ed. Thanks very much.
And I want to thank Ian Lee, MBA Director of the Sprott School of Business, for his thoughts on the federal election jobs and economy platform. Now, a small business is the engine of the economy. We hear that. But for many, the economy is not firing on all cylinders. And to get some perspective on what its members are looking for, I am pleased to be joined by Dan Kelly, President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And thanks for joining us on the Cafe, Dan.
Happy to be here.
Now, when you spoke to your members, less than 20% think the government's done a good job developing policies to support the middle class. What are your members looking for out of this next election?
Well, a few things. One is that the tax side of the equation has been hit pretty hard over the last few years, and they're looking for some relief. Remember, of course, there was a giant fight with the federal government over some tax changes for small businesses in 2017. The memory of that has not gone away. A lot of business owners remain pretty frustrated with some of the pieces that weren't removed in the 11th hour. There were changes to the way that dividends are taxed for families, also the way that passive investment income is taxed. So they'd love some relief from that. Also, of course, Canada Pension Plan premiums are going up for the next 6 years. There was already a hike this year. We've got, on top of that, in 5 provinces, including Ontario, carbon taxation. The federal carbon tax is actually heavily paid by independent businesses, with exemptions for large firms and, of course, rebates for consumers. The cost picked up by small firms. So, I think one of the big things we're hearing from our members is relief from some of the heavy tax burden that they've been facing over the last few years, the increasing tax burden, plus a lightening of some of the regulatory load, which continues to be high.
Let's follow up on the carbon tax there for a minute, and you talk about small businesses will end up carrying the brunt of the costs, as obviously citizens will be getting rebates, and you say big businesses get it as well. How do you see small business carrying the weight here?
We did some research that showed that almost 50% of the total cost of the carbon tax, and that's billions of dollars rising over the next 4 years, will be borne by independently owned small and medium-sized companies together with some municipalities, hospitals, school divisions. The federal government designed this such that, and the ads were that, don't worry, consumers, you're going to get a rebate check that is larger than the amount that you're actually going to pay in the new carbon tax. Large firms, the largest emitters in Canada have, of course, carved out emissions exemptions of about 80% of what they pollute. So the cost is going to be heavily borne by small firms. Of the rebate stream, only 7% is dedicated to small and medium-sized companies, and it took months and months to even get any details of how they were going to go about that. So, look, small firms are on board to do things to try to reduce their environmental footprint, but it doesn't seem fair that if we're all in this together to fight the issue of climate change, that you would be passing checks out to consumers on the eve of an election and then passing the bill to small businesses, many of whom are already struggling.
And when you look at large firms that have the exemptions, it doesn't appear that they're carrying their weight at all.
There are other measures for some of the larger firms, to be fair, but yeah, on the carbon tax itself, it is, about 80% of the pollution from the largest emitters in the country is exempt from the carbon tax. And gosh, at some point you wonder, how is this thing cooked up? It surely doesn't seem fair to independently owned and operated businesses. And again, on top of that, we've got CPP premium increases. We have the 2017 tax changes going into effect. There was a bunch of labor code changes. So there's been a lot. Now, to be fair to the federal Liberals, they've done a few things, I think, quite well. They've been pretty positive, I think, for overall on the trade side. They got NAFTA largely across the finish line. There were some pretty significant capital cost allowance changes for manufacturers and those that have heavy capital investments planned. There is some relief for them. So it's balanced with some good news. On credit card processing fees also, the Liberals have made some promises that we quite like. In fact, they quoted my organization by surprise in their announcements. So it's not all bad, but I got to tell you, there is a degree of frustration that still exists with many in the small business community.
Dan Kelly joining us on the Unpublished Cafe, president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, as we look at what small business is looking for in terms of the economy in this upcoming federal election. Now, your members want a more competitive tax environment, and what would make it more competitive?
Well, for one thing, rolling back some of those 2017 tax changes would really help them an awful lot. If you have a spouse working in your business or even owning the business with you, now there's a huge paper chase to try to prove their contributions. We'd like to have a full spousal exemption so you can share income with your spouse in a limited fashion. We'd also like the federal government to ditch the passive investment changes that they made that really do, I think, make it harder for businesses to save for their own retirement or to invest in the firm in the future. The Conservatives actually have made some commitments on that front that we quite like. Another item that we've been asking for years has been to see to allow business owners to sell their businesses to their kids, to family members, at the same tax treatment as if they sell it to a stranger. It's crazy. I think most people don't know that if you sell it to a stranger, you as a business owner are much better off than if you sell your business to your kids. And we want to change to that policy. We've been lobbying for that for years. And the NDP was the first party that put that forward as a proposal. So we're actually pleased to see small business featured in the platforms of the Tories, the Liberals, and the NDP in some ways. There's lots in those platforms we don't like, but there has been some progress made already.
Dan Kelly joining us from on the Unpublished Cafe with the CFIB. And to tell you the truth, I was not expecting you to say something positive about the NDP, but you've said
we are nonpartisan. Yeah. We're a nonpartisan organization. We fight the good fight on policies we disagree with, and we'll certainly be there to complement good policy when we see it. There's several in the NDP. The NDP was the first party during the last election that proposed reducing the small business corporate tax rate to 9%. Then the Tories followed by legislating it while they were still in power. Then the Liberals and the Green Party, to be fair, they all endorsed that policy prior to the 2015 election. Of course, after the 2015 election, the Liberals decided, oh, forget it, we're not going to lower the tax rate to 9%. They scrapped that in their very first budget. And then after the 2017 tax fight, they brought it back and taped the promise back together, delivered on it just earlier this year. So look, all parties obviously have an agenda for small business. We're pleased to see that. There's lots in a lot of the platforms, though, that I think would set us back, and we're watching those things very, very closely, sharing the full answers on our website, cfib.ca, for small business owners to see what the party leaders are saying specific to small business, what's going to help them, what's going to harm them, and then, of course, allowing business owners to make up their own decisions as to which way they wish to vote.
Well, one of the key concerns of your members, small business owners, is the current debt and deficit of the federal government. And, small business owners know all about debt and deficit and having to keep that under control. They'd like to see the government act a little bit more like a small business?
Absolutely. Look, small business owners know that today's deficits are tomorrow's tax hikes. The bills come due. And we've seen this happen. Right now in Ontario, one of the reasons why there is so much budget pressure is that the government is actually trying to clean up a giant deficit mess left to them by the previous government. We can't do this forever. Yeah, sure, there's, the world's not going to come to an end if you run a deficit once in a while. And we've got to make sure that, of course, we're prepared for recessions when government spending sometimes is necessary as a stopgap to a decline in the private sector. But you can't forever run deficits. And I think that, unfortunately, Canadians have become a little more comfortable with governments running long-term deficits. Small business owners have learned the hard way how difficult that is. And I'm worried that the electorate is forgetting about that. We need to make sure that political parties are focused on bringing down the deficit. It's very, very easy to make election promises. Look, if I've got an 11-year-old son, I can be Santa Claus for a while, and spend money on all the things that he wishes to have. But if the end of it we're risking losing the house, that's not a good long-term strategy, too.
That's a great analogy, Dan. I want to thank you for joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. I really appreciate your insight.
Anytime at all.
And I want to thank Dan Kelly, president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, for joining us on the Cafe. Now it's time to hear from you. Which party's economic platform makes the most sense to you? The Liberals, Conservative, NDP, or the Green Party? You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote and have your say. I want to thank Ian Lee, the MBA director of the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University, for joining us, and Dan Kelly, president of the CFIB. And I want to thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand.